The amber light blinked red at 0347 hours. Then it went dark completely. In the communications bunker beneath Forward Operating Base Blackwater, the silence stretched like a held breath. Static filled the headsets where voice traffic should have been flowing. The primary satellite uplink had been compromised for the third time in 2 weeks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Major Rebecca Hayes stared at the blank screen, her jaw set in a way that made the junior enlisted personnel step back instinctively. The mission clock continued its relentless countdown, 72 hours until the diplomatic convoy would attempt passage through the Kandahar corridor. Without real-time intelligence, they were sending those vehicles into a potential slaughter. "Sir, we're getting intermittent signals from Recon Team Alpha," Sergeant First Class Martinez reported, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "Last transmission was 6 hours ago. Grid reference puts them 12 clicks north of the target zone, but the coordinates keep shifting." Hayes didn't respond immediately. She was studying the tactical display, watching as red markers blinked in and out of existence across the digital map. Each blinking dot represented a potential threat: insurgent positions, IED placements, sniper nests. The intelligence was fragmentary, unreliable, and growing more dangerous by the hour. The situation had been deteriorating for months. Operation Clearwater was supposed to be a textbook counterinsurgency mission. Establish security corridors, eliminate high-value targets, and create safe passage for diplomatic and humanitarian efforts. Instead, it had become a grinding war of attrition fought in urban streets and mountain passes that seemed to shift like sand. Every conventional approach had failed. Air reconnaissance couldn't penetrate the elaborate tunnel networks the insurgents had constructed. Drone surveillance was compromised by sophisticated jamming equipment. Human intelligence networks had been systematically dismantled through targeted assassinations and intimidation campaigns. The enemy wasn't just fighting, they were adapting, learning, evolving faster than traditional military doctrine could respond. They moved through the civilian population like ghosts, striking without warning and disappearing before retaliation could be organized. Lieutenant Colonel David Patterson entered the bunker with the measured stride of a man carrying impossible weight. His uniform was pressed despite the circumstances, but his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had watched too many good soldiers come home in flag-draped boxes. "Status report," he said, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Wouldn't be good. Sir, we've lost contact with 3 reconnaissance teams in the past 48 hours. Hayes replied, her voice professionally neutral. "Signal intelligence indicates coordinated jamming operations across the entire operational area. Our standard infiltration routes have been compromised." Patterson studied the tactical display, his fingers drumming against the edge of the console. Red zones had expanded across the map like a spreading infection. Areas that had been secured just days ago now showed hostile activity. The insurgents weren't just holding ground, they were taking it back, systematically, methodically. "What about the diplomatic convoy?" he asked, though he seemed to already know this answer too. "Ambassador Williams is insisting on the original timeline," Hayes said carefully. "The peace negotiations are scheduled to begin in 96 hours. Any delay will be interpreted as weakness by both sides." The mathematics were brutal and simple. The convoy needed to reach the neutral zone for the talks to proceed. The route required passage through territory now controlled by insurgent forces. Without current intelligence about enemy positions, the mission was essentially suicide. In the corner of the bunker, Staff Sergeant Michael Chun was working frantically at a communications console, cycling through frequencies and trying to raise any of the missing teams. His efforts were met with static, electronic warfare countermeasures. and the occasional burst of encrypted enemy communications that their systems couldn't decode. "Sir, I'm picking up chatter on the insurgent frequencies," Chun reported. "It's heavily encrypted, but the volume has increased significantly in the past 6 hours. They're coordinating something big." Patterson's expression darkened. Intelligence suggested the insurgents had acquired advanced communications equipment, possibly from foreign military suppliers. They were operating with a level of sophistication that conventional counterinsurgency tactics weren't designed to handle. The failure wasn't just tactical, it was systematic. Traditional military doctrine assumed certain advantages: superior technology, better training, reliable intelligence networks. Those assumptions were proving false in an environment where the enemy could blend into the civilian population and where every piece of electronic equipment was potentially compromised. Major. Hayes pulled up a series of after-action reports on her tablet, scrolling through pages of failed operations and costly mistakes. Each mission had followed established protocols, utilized proven tactics, and been executed by highly trained personnel. Each had ended in casualties, intelligence failures, or strategic setbacks. "The problem isn't our people," she said quietly, speaking more to herself than to Patterson. "It's our approach. We're fighting a 20th century war against a 21st century enemy." The insurgents understood something that the military hierarchy was struggling to accept. In this kind of conflict, adaptability mattered more than firepower. They could disappear into crowds, move through tunnel systems that didn't appear on any map, and strike using weapons and tactics that weren't covered in a field manual. At 0400 hours, the situation deteriorated further. A coded message arrived through secure channels. Recon Team Bravo had missed their scheduled check-in. That made 4 teams now operating without communication in hostile territory. The operational area was effectively a black hole where American forces disappeared and intelligence went to die. Patterson was reviewing casualty reports when Captain Lisa Rodriguez approached with a folder marked with the highest security classification. Her expression was grim as she placed the documents on the table. "Sir, these are the latest intelligence assessments from the division," she said. "They're recommending that we abort the diplomatic mission and withdraw to defensive positions." The folder contained satellite imagery showing insurgent buildups along every major route. Analysis suggested coordinated attacks were being planned to coincide with the convoy's passage. The intelligence community's assessment was clear. The mission could not succeed using conventional methods, but conventional methods were all they had. Military doctrine, refined through decades of warfare, provided clear protocols for every situation. Those protocols had worked in desert warfare, jungle campaigns, and urban combat zones around the world. They were failing here because this wasn't a conventional war. The insurgents had studied American tactics, identified weaknesses, and developed countermeasures. They knew how reconnaissance teams operated, how communication systems worked, how military hierarchies made decisions. They were using that knowledge to systematically dismantle every advantage. The American forces thought they possessed in the intelligence briefing room. Analysts were struggling with incomplete data and contradictory reports. Maps showed friendly positions that might no longer exist. Enemy locations were based on intelligence that was hours or days old. The entire picture was fragmentary, unreliable, and growing more dangerous by the moment. Technical Sergeant Amanda Foster was working with signals intelligence, trying to decode the increasing volume of insurgent communications. The enemy was using sophisticated encryption, frequency hopping, and communication protocols that suggested foreign military training. They weren't just local fighters. They were part of a coordinated network with access to advanced technology and professional expertise. "Ma'am, I'm seeing communication patterns that suggest multi-level coordination," Foster reported to Major Hayes. "This isn't opportunistic resistance. It's organized, disciplined, and professionally executed. The realization was settling over the command staff like a cold weight. They weren't facing a local insurgency that could be defeated through superior firepower and traditional tactics. They were confronting a sophisticated opponent that had studied their methods, identified their weaknesses, and developed strategies specifically designed to neutralize American military advantages. Outside the bunker, the base was a hive of activity. As personnel prepared for missions that everyone knew were increasingly unlikely to succeed, helicopters sat on the tarmac, their crews ready to launch into airspace that was becoming more dangerous by the hour. Ground vehicles were loaded with equipment that might not function properly in the electronic warfare environment they would encounter. The enemy had turned the operational area into a maze where American forces moved blindly while insurgents watched from the shadows. Every communication was potentially compromised. Every movement was potentially tracked. Every mission was potentially walking into a carefully prepared trap. At 0430 hours, the situation became critical. A flash message arrived from higher headquarters. Intelligence sources indicated that the insurgents were planning a coordinated, offensive timed to coincide with the diplomatic convoy's departure. The attack would target not just the convoy itself, but the entire forward operating base, using weapons and tactics that American forces had not previously encountered in this theater. Major Hayes looked at the tactical display, now showing a sea of red markers across the operational area. The enemy had achieved something that military strategists had warned about, but never experienced. They had made the battlefield itself their weapon, turning every advantage of terrain, technology, and local knowledge against the American forces. The crisis was complete. Conventional methods had failed. Traditional intelligence networks had been compromised. Standard operating procedures were proving inadequate against an enemy that had evolved beyond the scope of existing doctrine. The diplomatic mission crucial for regional stability and peace negotiations was scheduled to proceed into territory that had become a carefully orchestrated killing field. In the communications bunker, the amber light continued to blink red, marking time until a decision would have to be made. The countdown continued, inexorable and unforgiving, toward a moment when American forces would have to choose between abandoning their mission or walking into a trap that conventional military wisdom had no solution for. The silence in the bunker was broken only by the soft hum of equipment and the distant sound of helicopters preparing for missions that might not return. In 71 hours, the convoy would leave the wire, carrying diplomats toward negotiations that could end the conflict. Without reliable intelligence, that convoy would be traveling blind into territory controlled by an enemy that had proven capable of anticipating and countering every move the American military made. The crisis had reached its breaking point. Traditional solutions had been exhausted. The enemy had adapted faster than American doctrine could respond. In a war where information was the ultimate weapon, the United States was fighting blind against an opponent that seemed to see everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Sarah Thompson sat in the far corner of the base mess hall, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The morning briefing had ended 30 minutes earlier, but she remained at the scratched metal table, watching steam rise from other soldiers' breakfast trays while her own remained untouched. She wasn't supposed to be here. According to the official orders that had arrived 3 months ago, Captain Thompson was assigned to intelligence analysis duties exclusively. No field operations. No direct engagement with hostile forces. No participation in missions that could place her in combat situations. The directive had been clear, unambiguous, and delivered with the kind of bureaucratic finality that ended careers. The reasoning was equally clear, though never officially stated. The incident in Syria had made headlines, created congressional inquiries, and generated enough political heat to reshape military policy regarding female personnel in specialized operations. The fact that Thompson had successfully extracted 3 captured intelligence officers, while eliminating a high-value target, was irrelevant compared to the public relations nightmare that followed. Now she spent her days in climate-controlled bunkers, analyzing satellite imagery and writing reports that other people would use to plan missions she wasn't allowed to join. Her expertise in infiltration, her fluency in 6 languages including local dialects, her documented ability to move undetected through hostile populations, all of it was considered too valuable to risk and too controversial to utilize. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same skills that had made her indispensable in previous operations had become the reason she was now considered untouchable. Military leadership wanted the intelligence she could gather, but they didn't want the political complications that came with deploying a female operative in combat zones. Thompson had grown up in military families scattered across 3 continents. Her father was a career diplomat, her mother a foreign service officer specializing in Middle Eastern affairs. She had learned Arabic before she learned algebra, understood cultural nuances that couldn't be taught in classrooms, and developed an intuitive grasp of how to navigate complex social dynamics in regions where a single misstep could mean death. Her military career had been unconventional from the beginning. While other officers followed traditional paths through established command structures, Thompson had been recruited into specialized units that operated in the gray areas between military doctrine and political necessity. She had spent years in places that didn't appear on official maps, working with assets whose names never appeared in after-action reports. The work had suited her perfectly. She understood that effective intelligence gathering required more than technical expertise. It demanded cultural sensitivity, linguistic precision, and the ability to build trust with people who had every reason to distrust American motives. She could disappear into local populations, establish networks of human sources, and gather information that satellites and electronic surveillance couldn't capture. But that was before Syria, before the mission that had saved American lives but created a political firestorm that reached the highest levels of government, before congressional hearings about women in combat roles and media coverage that turned operational success into bureaucratic liability. The official account described the Syria operation as an unauthorized deviation from established protocols. The classified version told a different story. Thompson had identified critical intelligence about planned attacks against American diplomatic facilities. When official channels proved too slow and cumbersome, she had acted independently, using networks she had developed through months of careful relationship building. The mission had prevented multiple terrorist attacks and rescued personnel who would have otherwise faced execution. It had also violated every protocol about chain of command, operational authorization, and risk management. The political fallout had been swift and decisive. Thompson was reassigned to analysis duties pending a comprehensive review of women's roles in high-risk operations. That review had concluded 3 months ago with the determination that Thompson's skills were valuable, but her deployment created unacceptable political and operational risks. She would continue to serve, but in carefully controlled circumstances that ensured she would never again face the kind of situation that had made her simultaneously a hero and a liability. Now she watched other officers prepare for missions she could have executed more effectively than anyone else in the command. Her analysis work was excellent. Her reports were detailed, accurate, and provided insights that field commanders found invaluable. But analysis was a substitute for action, and Thompson knew that the current crisis required the kind of on-ground intelligence that could only be gathered through direct infiltration. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh approached Thompson's table with the cautious respect reserved for officers whose reputations preceded them. Walsh worked in the intelligence section and had read enough classified reports to understand what Thompson had accomplished during her operational career. "Ma'am," Major Hayes is asking for your assessment of the latest intercepts, Walsh said, placing a folder of encrypted communications on the table. The linguists are having trouble with some of the dialect variations. Thompson opened the folder and began reading through transcripts of intercepted insurgent communications. The language was a complex mixture of formal Arabic, local tribal dialects, and code words that changed meaning based on context and speaker relationships. It was exactly the kind of linguistic puzzle that Thompson had been solving for years in operational environments. "This isn't just tactical coordination," Thompson said after reviewing several pages. "They're discussing specific American personnel. By name. Someone has detailed intelligence about our command structure, operational patterns, and individual officer backgrounds." Walsh leaned forward, her expression concerned. "How detailed?" Thompson pointed to a section of transcript where insurgent operatives discussed the female analyst who speaks our language. The conversation included references to Thompson's previous deployments, her family background, and her current assignment. To intelligence duties. Someone had compiled a comprehensive dossier on her activities and was sharing that information with hostile forces. "They know more about our personnel than our own security clearance investigations reveal," Thompson continued. "This level of intelligence gathering suggests either a serious compromise of our internal systems or human sources with extraordinary access to classified information." The implications were disturbing. If insurgent forces had detailed intelligence about American personnel, they could target specific individuals for assassination, blackmail, or capture. They could anticipate operational patterns and prepare countermeasures for any mission before it began. Most importantly, they could identify and eliminate anyone who posed a particular threat to their activities. Thompson continued reading through the intercepts, noting patterns in the language that revealed organizational structure, operational priorities, and strategic thinking. The insurgents weren't just planning attacks. They were conducting sophisticated intelligence operations that would have impressed professional spy agencies. "Ma'am," Walsh said quietly, "there's something else. These communications include references to the one who walks among us. They're talking about an American who has successfully infiltrated their networks in the past." Thompson looked up from the transcripts. The phrase "walks among us" was significant in local dialects. It implied someone who could move through communities without detection, who understood cultural nuances well enough to avoid suspicion, who could gather information while appearing to belong. "They're talking about someone specific," Thompson said. "Someone they consider a particular threat because of previous successful infiltrations." The description matched Thompson's own operational profile exactly. During her deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, she had developed techniques for blending into local populations that had proven extraordinarily effective. She could modify her appearance, adjust her behavior patterns, and adopt cultural mannerisms convincingly enough to gather intelligence from sources who never realized they were speaking to an American operative. But those techniques had also made her controversial within military leadership. Traditional doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower and technological superiority. Thompson's methods relied on cultural adaptation, linguistic skills, and human relationship building approaches that were difficult to systematize, regulate, or replicate through standard training programs. The insurgents understood the threat she represented better than her own command structure did. They had identified her as someone capable of penetrating their security measures, gathering critical intelligence, and disrupting their operations in ways that conventional military approaches couldn't match. Thompson closed the folder and looked at Walsh. "Has anyone shared this analysis with Major Hayes?" "Not yet, ma'am. I wanted to get your assessment first." Thompson considered the implications. The intercepts revealed that insurgent forces had comprehensive intelligence about American operations, including specific knowledge about personnel who had previously conducted successful infiltration missions. They were preparing countermeasures designed to neutralize threats they had identified through careful study of American tactics and capabilities, but the same intelligence that revealed insurgent preparation also suggested an opportunity. If they were concerned about infiltration, it meant their security wasn't as comprehensive as their tactical successes suggested. Someone with the right skills, operating independently of conventional support structures, might still be able to penetrate their defenses and gather the intelligence that conventional methods had failed to obtain. "Sergeant Walsh," Thompson said carefully, "who else has access to these particular intercepts?" "Just the immediate intelligence team, ma'am." "Major Hayes restricted distribution pending analysis." Thompson stood and gathered the folder. "I'll brief Major Hayes directly. This information needs to be compartmentalized until we understand the full implications." As Walsh departed, Thompson remained standing beside the table, her mind working through possibilities that military doctrine didn't address. The insurgents had adapted to conventional American tactics, but their countermeasures were designed for traditional military operations. Someone operating outside those parameters, using techniques that weren't documented in field manuals, might still be able to achieve what conventional forces couldn't. The thought was both appealing and dangerous. Thompson knew she possessed skills that could potentially solve the intelligence crisis that was paralyzing American operations. She also knew that any attempt to utilize those skills would violate explicit orders and end her military career permanently. But careers were less important than lives. The diplomatic convoy was scheduled to depart in 67 hours, carrying personnel who would die if they encountered the coordinated attacks that insurgent communications suggested were being planned. Conventional intelligence gathering had failed to provide the information needed to ensure their safety. Thompson walked toward the intelligence section, carrying analysis that revealed both the scope of the threat and the potential solution. The insurgents had studied American methods and prepared countermeasures for every conventional approach. But they might not be prepared for someone who operated outside conventional parameters entirely. The question wasn't whether she could gather the needed intelligence. Thompson was confident in her abilities and understood the operational environment better than anyone else currently available. The question was whether military leadership would recognize that solving this crisis required abandoning the policies that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized operation that the situation demanded. In her pocket, Thompson carried identification documents that authorized her for intelligence analysis duties only. But she also carried other forms of identification, obtained through channels that didn't appear in official records, that would allow her to move through the operational area in ways that conventional forces couldn't match. The insurgents expected American forces to operate according to established doctrine. They had prepared countermeasures for every conventional approach, but they might not expect someone who could walk among them undetected, gathering the intelligence that satellites and electronic surveillance couldn't capture, using methods that military regulations had been designed to prohibit. The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn quiet at 0515 hours. Captain Thompson was already awake, having spent the night analyzing communication intercepts when the alarm system activated across forward operating base Blackwater. Through the reinforced windows of the intelligence center, she could see personnel running toward defensive positions as red warning lights bathed the compound in harsh, strobing illumination. All stations, this is base defense control," came the voice over the loudspeaker system. "We have multiple inbound contacts bearing 270. Estimated time to impact 4 minutes. This is not a drill." Thompson grabbed her body armor and weapon, following established procedures even though her orders technically restricted her to non-combat duties. The incoming attack would make such distinctions irrelevant. When mortar started falling, everyone became a combatant regardless of their official assignment. Major Hayes burst into the intelligence center as Thompson was securing classified materials in the vault. "Captain, I need your assessment of these intercepts immediately, Hayes said, thrusting a tablet containing fresh communication intelligence toward her. We picked up chatter about a coordinated assault, but the timing doesn't match what we're seeing. Thompson scanned the Arabic text while explosions began erupting beyond the perimeter. The insurgent communications described a diversionary attack designed to draw American forces away from their primary defensive positions. The real assault would come from a different direction, using tunnels that didn't appear on any military maps. "Ma'am, this is a feint," Thompson said, pointing to specific phrases in the intercepts. "They're using the mortar attack to mask movement through underground passages. The main assault will come from the southeast, probably through the civilian settlement." Hayes looked at the tactical display, showing American forces repositioning to counter the mortar attack from the west. "How certain are you about this analysis?" "The language patterns are consistent with previous operations I've seen," Thompson replied. "They're using code words that reference the path beneath the stones, in local dialect. That specifically means tunnel networks." Another explosion, closer this time, rattled the bunker walls. Hayes keyed her radio to contact the command post. "Base defense, intelligence. We have analysis suggesting the primary attack will come from the southeast through subsurface routes. Recommend repositioning quick reaction force to cover that sector." The response crackled back through static and background noise. "Intelligence, base defense, negative on repositioning. We have confirmed visual contact with advancing forces from the west. All available personnel are committed to current defensive positions." Thompson watched the tactical display as American forces concentrated their firepower against the diversionary attack while the real threat approached undetected through routes that conventional surveillance couldn't monitor. It was exactly the kind of tactical sophistication that had made insurgent forces so effective against traditional military responses. The attack continued for 3 hours, following precisely the pattern Thompson had identified in the intercepts. Mortar rounds and small arms fire from the west kept American forces engaged while insurgent sappers moved through tunnel systems to plant explosives beneath key defensive positions. When the diversionary attack suddenly ceased, the real assault began with coordinated demolitions that created gaps in the perimeter defenses. By dawn, the damage assessment revealed the effectiveness of insurgent planning. 2 observation towers had been destroyed. A section of the perimeter wall had been breached, and the main communications array had been severely damaged. More critically, the attack had demonstrated that insurgent forces possessed detailed intelligence about base defenses and could coordinate complex operations that neutralized American technological advantages. Colonel Patterson convened an emergency staff meeting at 0800 hours. The assembled officers looked haggard, their uniforms still bearing dust and debris from the night's engagement. The conference room's windows had been covered with blast shields, giving the meeting a claustrophobic atmosphere that matched the mood of everyone present. At 2130 hours, Captain Thompson made a decision that would either save lives or end her career. She sat alone in her quarters, surrounded by maps, cultural reference materials, and identity documents that weren't supposed to exist. The official documentation in her personnel file showed standard military identification. The materials spread across her desk told a different story. Thompson had spent years developing what intelligence professionals called operational flexibility, the ability to assume different identities convincingly enough to operate in hostile environments. The documents before her represented personas she had cultivated during previous deployments: a freelance journalist, a humanitarian aid worker, a graduate student researching regional dialects. Each identity had been carefully constructed with authentic documentation, established history, and cultural details that would withstand scrutiny. More importantly, none of these identities appeared in any military database that could have been compromised by insurgent intelligence networks. The decision wasn't about Courage Thompson had proven her willingness to accept risk during previous operations. It was about calculating whether unauthorized action was justified when authorized channels had been systematically compromised. The mathematics were stark. In 46 hours, American diplomats would die unless someone gathered intelligence that conventional methods couldn't obtain. Thompson selected the identity of Dr. Amira Khalil, a linguistics researcher from the FAFOS couldn't obtain. Thompson selected the identity of Dr. Amira Khalil, a linguistics researcher from the Amira Khalil, a linguistics researcher from the American University of Beirut, studying regional dialect variations. The persona had been developed during her deployment in Syria, complete with academic credentials, publication history, and cultural background that would explain her presence in the operational area. The transformation required more than changing clothes. Thompson adjusted her posture, modified her speech patterns, and adopted the mannerisms of someone who had spent years in academic environments rather than military installations. She practiced expressions of intellectual curiosity rather than tactical awareness, scholarly enthusiasm rather than operational focus. But the most critical element was psychological. Thompson had to genuinely become Dr. Khalil, thinking like an academic researcher rather than a military intelligence officer. Any trace of her real background would be detected by people who had survived years of conflict by reading human behavior with extraordinary accuracy. She began by changing her appearance in ways that surveillance systems wouldn't detect but human observation would. Traditional disguise techniques focused on dramatic alterations that cameras could identify. Thompson's approach emphasized subtle modifications that changed how people perceived her. Without triggering electronic detection systems, she darkened her hair using commercial dye and adjusted her makeup to emphasize different facial features. More importantly, she modified her posture and gait to match someone who spent time hunched over books rather than maintaining military bearing. The changes were subtle but comprehensive, creating an entirely different physical presence. The clothing was equally important. Dr. Khalil wore practical but academic attire, sturdy hiking boots suitable for field research, cargo pants with pockets for notebooks and recording equipment, and a lightweight jacket that could accommodate research materials without suggesting tactical gear. Thompson packed research equipment that would support her academic cover, digital audio recorders for collecting dialect samples, notebooks filled with linguistic observations, and university identification that would explain her presence in remote areas. Hidden within the academic materials were communication devices and navigation equipment disguised as research tools. At midnight, she accessed her personal vehicle, a civilian sedan that wasn't registered in military databases. The car had been purchased through channels that maintained her academic identity, complete with registration documents showing Dr. Khalil as the owner. Even the insurance record supported her cover story. Thompson drove through the base checkpoint using identification that showed her as a contract linguist authorized for off-base research. The guards recognized her face, but not the civilian clothing or academic documentation. To them, she was simply a contractor returning to work that didn't concern military operations. The transformation wasn't complete until she left the base entirely. Only then did Thompson allow herself to fully assume the Dr. Khalil persona, adjusting her mental framework from military officer to academic researcher. The shift was psychological as much as physical. She had to genuinely believe in her cover identity for it to be convincing to others. Her first destination was a roadside cafe 20 kilometers from the base, a location where local civilians gathered to discuss current events and exchange information. Military personnel avoided such places, considering them security risks. For Dr. Khalil, they represented research opportunities where she could collect dialect samples and cultural observations. Thompson entered the cafe with the slightly uncertain manner of an academic unfamiliar with local customs. She ordered tea in carefully accented Arabic, speaking with the linguistic precision of someone who had learned the language, formally rather than through operational necessity. Her notebook remained visible, filled with phonetic notations and vocabulary observations that supported her research cover. The cafe's patrons initially regarded her with suspicion. Foreign researchers weren't uncommon, but they often worked with military or intelligence agencies. Thompson's behavior patterns, however, suggested genuine academic interest rather than intelligence gathering. She asked questions about regional speech variations, recorded pronunciation differences, and showed the kind of scholarly enthusiasm that was difficult to fake convincingly. Within an hour, she had established herself as a harmless academic whose presence posed no threat to local populations. More importantly, she had begun gathering intelligence that conventional surveillance couldn't access. Conversations in the cafe revealed transportation patterns, mentions of strangers asking questions, and references to activities that suggested insurgent operations. The information wasn't specific enough for tactical planning, but it confirmed that insurgent forces were active in areas the diplomatic convoy would traverse. Thompson noted locations mentioned in casual conversation, timing references that suggested coordination, and behavioral patterns that indicated heightened security awareness among local populations. Her linguistic expertise proved invaluable for interpreting subtle communications. Local dialects included code words and cultural references that wouldn't be detected by electronic surveillance or understood by translators unfamiliar with regional nuances. Thompson could identify when seemingly innocent conversations contained operational information. She left the cafe with contact information for local guides who could provide access to remote research areas. These guides operated independently of official channels and possessed detailed knowledge of terrain features that didn't appear on military maps. More importantly, they moved through areas where military reconnaissance teams had been captured or eliminated. Thompson's next stop was a small market where vendors sold goods transported through various supply networks. Academic researchers often visited such locations to study economic patterns and cultural exchange. For intelligence purposes, markets provided information about transportation routes, security conditions, and population movements. She approached vendors with questions about regional trade patterns, asking about routes used for transporting goods and seasonal variations in commercial activity. The conversations revealed which roads were currently safe for civilian travel and which areas were being avoided due to security concerns. One vendor mentioned that several regular supply routes had been disrupted recently due to security incidents. Another described increased military activity in areas that supposedly remained under government control. These observations provided intelligence about insurgent operations that official reporting hadn't captured. Thompson purchased local textiles and handicrafts, establishing herself as a legitimate customer while gathering information about the supply networks that moved goods through the operational area. She learned about alternative transportation routes that insurgent forces might use for movement and logistics. The intelligence gathering continued through casual conversations that revealed security conditions, population attitudes, and operational patterns. Thompson's academic cover allowed her to ask questions that would have aroused suspicion from a military source but seemed natural from a researcher studying regional culture. By 0300 hours, she had collected enough preliminary intelligence to confirm that insurgent forces were conducting sophisticated operations throughout the convoy route. The information wasn't precise enough for military targeting, but it provided the foundation for more detailed reconnaissance that conventional methods couldn't accomplish. Thompson returned to her vehicle and drove toward a safe house she had identified during her previous intelligence analysis. The location was a small apartment in a civilian neighborhood, rented through academic channels that wouldn't appear in military databases. She had established the facility during her analysis work, recognizing that effective intelligence gathering might require Operational flexibility. The safe house contained additional identity documents, communication equipment, and cultural materials that supported various cover identities. More importantly, it provided a secure location where Thompson could analyze the intelligence she had gathered and plan more detailed reconnaissance operations. She spent the remaining hours of darkness organizing the information collected during her initial foray. The intelligence confirmed that insurgent forces were operating with detailed knowledge of American plans, but it also revealed potential vulnerabilities in their security arrangements. They were focused on countering conventional military reconnaissance and might not expect infiltration by someone operating outside official channels. Thompson's approach represented a fundamental departure from established military doctrine. Instead of using technological superiority and overwhelming firepower, she was employing cultural adaptation and human intelligence gathering. The method was risky because it couldn't be supervised or controlled through normal command structures, but it was also potentially effective because it operated outside the systems that insurgent intelligence had penetrated. At dawn, she reviewed the intelligence gathered during the night's reconnaissance. The information provided a foundation for understanding insurgent operations, but detailed intelligence about specific threats to the diplomatic convoy would require deeper penetration into areas where conventional forces couldn't operate safely. Thompson faced a critical decision. She could return to base with the preliminary intelligence she had gathered, providing enough information to justify official authorization for her continued operation. Alternatively, she could continue operating independently, gathering the detailed intelligence that might save the diplomatic convoy but would definitely end her military career. The countdown continued, 38 hours until the convoy's departure. Conventional intelligence gathering had failed completely. Military reconnaissance teams had been systematically eliminated. Electronic surveillance had been compromised or neutralized. The only remaining option was continued unauthorized operation by someone whose methods couldn't be anticipated or countered by insurgent security measures. Thompson looked at the academic identification that had allowed her to move freely through areas where military personnel couldn't survive. Dr. Halil had accomplished more intelligence gathering in 6 hours than conventional reconnaissance had achieved in weeks. But utilizing that success would require continuing to operate outside the command structure that had been compromised by insurgent penetration. The decision was ultimately about priorities. Military regulations existed to maintain order and prevent unauthorized operations that could create political complications. But those same regulations had proven inadequate for dealing with an enemy that had studied American methods and developed comprehensive countermeasures. Thompson prepared for another day of reconnaissance, knowing that each hour of continued operation increased both the potential intelligence value and the personal risk. She was no longer just gathering information. She was demonstrating that effective action was possible even when conventional approaches had failed completely. The transformation from Captain Thompson to Dr. Halil was now complete. She had crossed the line from authorized analysis to unauthorized operation, from following orders to taking initiative, from working within the system to operating outside it entirely. The intelligence she was gathering could save lives, but the method she was using would ensure that her military career was over regardless of the operational outcome. Dr. Amira Halil adjusted the recording equipment in her backpack as she approached the remote village of Kalaino, 28 kilometers from the planned convoy route. The settlement wasn't marked on most military maps, but Thompson's analysis of insurgent communications had identified it as a coordination point for operations targeting the diplomatic mission. The village appeared peaceful in the morning, like mud brick houses clustered around a central well, children playing in dusty streets, merchants setting up small stalls selling vegetables and household goods. But Thompson's trained eye noticed details that suggested a different reality: the absence of military-age males, subtle defensive positions that could provide cover during combat, and communication equipment that seemed sophisticated for such. A remote location. She entered the village with the unhurried pace of an academic researcher, stopping to photograph traditional architecture and record ambient sounds that would support her linguistic cover story. Her behavior suggested someone fascinated by cultural authenticity rather than tactical intelligence, but her observations were cataloging everything that military significance. An elderly woman approached with the cautious hospitality typical of rural communities encountering foreign visitors. Thompson responded in formal Arabic, explaining her research into regional dialect preservation and expressing scholarly interest in local speech patterns. The conversation was conducted according to cultural protocols that established her as a respectful outsider seeking knowledge rather than intelligence. "You are far from the university," the woman observed, her dialect confirming Thompson's analysis of regional linguistic variations. "It is unusual for researchers to travel alone in these areas." Thompson smiled with the earnest enthusiasm of an academic pursuing important work. "Language changes quickly in isolated communities. If I don't record these speech patterns now, they may be lost to history. My professors always say that field research requires accepting some inconvenience." The response was carefully crafted to explain her presence while avoiding any suggestion of official connections. Academic researchers were generally welcomed in rural communities because they showed respect for local culture and didn't represent government or military interests that might bring unwanted attention. The woman invited Thompson to share tea, a gesture of hospitality that also served as an informal security screening. Over the next hour, Thompson answered questions about her research, her university background, and her travel plans. Each response reinforced her academic identity, while providing opportunities to gather intelligence about local conditions. During the conversation, Thompson learned that the village had experienced increased activity from government security forces in recent weeks. The description was deliberately vague, but contextual clues suggested that these forces weren't official military units. The timing coincided with preparations for attacks against the diplomatic convoy. More importantly, Thompson discovered that the village served as a logistics hub for operations throughout the region. Supplies moved through the community using networks that avoided official transportation routes, and communication messages were relayed through systems that couldn't be monitored by conventional surveillance. She obtained permission to interview elderly residents about traditional language use, a request that provided access to community leaders while maintaining her academic cover. These interviews revealed information about historical trade routes, seasonal migration patterns, and geographic features that didn't appear on current maps, but were crucial for understanding regional transportation networks. One interview proved particularly valuable. An elderly man described changes in local traffic patterns, mentioning that certain roads were now used primarily at night and that strangers had been asking questions about the routes the foreigners might take. The information confirmed that insurgent forces were conducting detailed reconnaissance of the convoy's planned path. Thompson's linguistic expertise allowed her to interpret subtle meanings in local dialects that electronic surveillance would miss entirely. References to visitors who come in the darkness met insurgent operatives. The road that leads to tomorrow was a coded reference to planned attacks. Stones that sing at dawn indicated improvised explosive devices positioned along transportation routes. By midday, she had gathered enough intelligence to confirm that insurgent forces were using the village as a coordination point for operations, targeting the diplomatic convoy. But the most significant discovery came through a conversation about the teacher who speaks many languages, a reference that clearly described someone matching Thompson's own operational profile. The discussion revealed that insurgent leadership was aware of American personnel capable of cultural infiltration and had developed specific countermeasures. They were conducting their own surveillance operations, looking for signs of infiltration attempts. More concerning, they had detailed information about American intelligence officers, including physical descriptions and operational methods. Thompson realized she was walking a tightrope between gathering essential intelligence and being detected by security measures specifically designed to identify someone with her exact capabilities. The insurgents weren't just preparing for conventional military responses, they were actively hunting for the kind of operative she represented. She modified her approach, emphasizing her academic credentials while subtly probing for information about security arrangements. The key was maintaining perfect consistency with her cover identity, while extracting intelligence that could save the diplomatic convoy from coordinated attacks. During an afternoon interview with a local shopkeeper, Thompson discovered the location of a staging area where insurgent forces were positioning equipment for attacks along the convoy route. The information was revealed indirectly through a discussion about transportation costs and delivery schedules that had been disrupted by security activities in specific geographic areas. The shopkeeper mentioned that certain supplies couldn't be delivered to traditional locations because the authorities had made those areas difficult to reach. Cross-referencing these comments with her knowledge of the convoy route, Thompson identified a coordination point approximately 15 kilometers from the planned path where insurgent forces were stockpiling weapons and explosives. More critically, she learned about timing. The shopkeeper complained that delivery schedules had been adjusted to accommodate special activities planned for the following day. The timing coincided exactly with the diplomatic convoy's scheduled passage, confirming that insurgent forces had detailed knowledge of American plans and were positioning resources accordingly. Thompson's next breakthrough came through a conversation with a local guide who transported goods through mountain passes that conventional vehicles couldn't navigate. The guide mentioned that certain routes had become unavailable for normal traffic due to preparations for important work that required secrecy and security. The geographic details provided precise intelligence about insurgent movement patterns and staging areas. Thompson mapped the information mentally, identifying choke points where attacks were likely to occur and alternative routes that might provide safer passage for the diplomatic convoy. But the most significant intelligence emerged through careful analysis of social dynamics within the village. Thompson noticed that certain residents deferred to a man who claimed to be a livestock trader, but whose behavior suggested military or security background. His presence indicated that insurgent leadership was personally supervising operations related to the convoy attack. She observed the man's interactions with other villagers, noting communication patterns that suggested operational coordination. His movements followed security protocols that were inconsistent with civilian livestock trading, but entirely appropriate for someone coordinating complex military operations. Thompson realized she had identified a high-value target whose capture or elimination could disrupt the entire insurgent operation against the diplomatic convoy. But pursuing that objective would require transitioning from intelligence gathering to direct action, a step that would definitely expose her operational identity and a possibility of continued covert reconnaissance. Instead, she focused on documenting the intelligence she had gathered while maintaining her academic cover. The information about staging areas, timing, and leadership presence would be invaluable for planning countermeasures, but it had to be transmitted through channels that wouldn't compromise her continued operation. As evening approached, Thompson prepared to leave the village with intelligence that could fundamentally alter the security situation for the diplomatic convoy. She had identified specific threat locations, confirmed attack timing, and located insurgent leadership elements. More importantly, she had demonstrated that human intelligence gathering could succeed where conventional methods had failed completely. The departure required careful management to avoid arousing suspicion. Thompson thanked her hosts for their hospitality, expressing genuine academic appreciation for the linguistic information she had collected. She promised to share her research findings with the academic community, maintaining her cover identity until the final moment. But as she walked toward her vehicle, Thompson noticed subtle changes in village activity that suggested her presence had been noted by security elements. Insurgent forces were conducting their own counterintelligence operations, and they had identified indicators that suggested potential infiltration. She reached her car without incident, but radio chatter in local dialects indicated that her departure was being reported to external coordination centers. The insurgents weren't just prepared for conventional American responses, they were actively monitoring for the kind of intelligence-gathering operation she had conducted. Thompson drove away from the village with mixed emotions. She had gathered intelligence that could save the diplomatic convoy, but her operational exposure meant that insurgent forces would now be actively searching for the teacher who speaks many languages. Her cover identity remained intact, but its utility was rapidly degrading. The countdown continued, 26 hours until convoy departure. Thompson had confirmed that insurgent forces were positioned for coordinated attacks, identified their staging areas and leadership elements, and gathered detailed intelligence about their operational planning. But transmitting that information to American forces would require revealing her unauthorized operation and accepting the consequences of violating explicit orders. More immediately, she faced tactical challenges that conventional training hadn't prepared her for. Insurgent counterintelligence operations were now focused on identifying and eliminating the source of potential intelligence gathering. Dr. Halil's academic cover provided some protection, but Thompson's operational methods had created indicators that trained security personnel could detect. She needed to transmit the intelligence she had gathered while evading counterintelligence operations designed specifically to prevent such communication. The solution would require operational creativity that military doctrine didn't address and personal risks that her superiors had explicitly prohibited her from accepting. But the mathematics remained unchanged. Without the intelligence she had gathered, the diplomatic convoy would drive into carefully prepared ambushes that would result in multiple casualties and complete mission failure. With that intelligence, American forces could potentially neutralize the threat and ensure successful completion of peace negotiations that could end years of conflict. Thompson drove through the gathering darkness toward another critical decision point, carrying intelligence that could change everything, but knowing that using it would end her military career and potentially her freedom. The breakthrough had been achieved, but the most dangerous phase of the operation was just beginning. At 0347 hours, 16 hours before the diplomatic convoy's scheduled departure, Thompson made contact with Forward Operating Base Blackwater using a secure communication protocol that bypassed standard military channels. She transmitted from an abandoned communications tower 20 kilometers from the village, using civilian equipment that wouldn't trigger insurgent counter-surveillance systems. The message was brief, encoded, and addressed specifically to Major Hayes using authentication codes that proved Thompson's identity without revealing her current operational status. The intelligence package contained precise coordinates for insurgent staging areas, detailed timing for planned attacks, and photographic evidence of weapons stockpiles positioned along the convoy route. Major Hayes received the transmission in the intelligence center, where she had been working continuously for 36 hours trying to develop actionable intelligence through conventional methods. The sudden appearance of detailed, current information about insurgent operations was so unexpected she initially suspected deception or compromise. Sergeant Walsh, Hayes called to her assistant, run authentication verification on this transmission. I want confirmation that these codes are legitimate and haven't been compromised. The verification process confirmed that the intelligence had originated from Captain Thompson using personal authentication protocols that weren't included in standard military databases. The codes were authentic, but their use suggested Thompson was operating outside official authorization. Hayes studied the intelligence package, recognizing immediately that it represented the breakthrough American forces desperately needed. The information was specific, current, and detailed enough to enable tactical countermeasures that could neutralize insurgent threats to the diplomatic convoy, but the implications were equally clear. Thompson had violated explicit orders restricting her to intelligence analysis duties. She had conducted unauthorized reconnaissance in hostile territory using methods that couldn't be supervised or controlled through normal command channels. Her success had been achieved through precisely the kind of operation that military leadership had prohibited. Hayes faced an impossible choice between operational necessity and regulatory compliance. The intelligence could save lives and ensure mission success, but utilizing it would require acknowledging that unauthorized action had succeeded where official channels had failed completely. She carried the intelligence package to Colonel Patterson's office, knowing that the decision about how to proceed would determine not only the fate of the diplomatic convoy, but also Thompson's future in the military. Patterson was reviewing casualty reports from the previous day's insurgent attack when Hayes knocked on his door. "Sir, we have intelligence about insurgent preparations for attacks against the diplomatic convoy," Hayes said, placing the decoded information on Patterson's desk. "It's detailed, current, and actionable." Patterson examined the intelligence, his expression shifting from skepticism to recognition as he absorbed the scope and precision of the information. "Where did this come from, Captain Thompson, sir?" "She's been conducting unauthorized reconnaissance using non-military cover identities." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Patterson understood immediately that Thompson had achieved what the entire military intelligence apparatus had failed to accomplish, but she had done so by violating direct orders and operating outside the chain of command. "How long has she been conducting unauthorized operations?" Patterson asked. "Based on the authentication timestamps, approximately 18 hours, Hayes replied. "She gathered intelligence that conventional reconnaissance couldn't obtain and identified threats that our standard surveillance methods completely missed." Patterson studied maps showing the insurgent positions Thompson had identified. The information revealed the scope of coordination between insurgent cells and confirmed that attacks were planned from multiple points along the convoy route. Without this intelligence, the diplomatic mission would have encountered overwhelming hostile forces at precisely calculated ambush sites. "Has anyone else seen this intelligence?" Patterson asked. "No, sir. I brought it directly to you upon receipt." Patterson considered options that all involved choosing between competing responsibilities. Military regulations demanded that unauthorized operations be stopped and personnel who violated orders be disciplined. Operational necessity demanded that actionable intelligence be utilized to prevent American casualties and mission failure. Decision was complicated by political considerations. Thompson's previous unauthorized operation in Syria had created congressional investigations and policy reviews. Another violation of operational protocols would generate scrutiny that could affect military leadership at the highest levels, but the intelligence was undeniably valuable. Thompson had identified specific insurgent staging areas, confirmed attack timing, and located leadership elements that represented high-value targets. The information was current, detailed, and precise enough to enable tactical responses that could neutralize threats to the diplomatic convoy. Patterson activated his secure communication system and contacted higher headquarters. Priority message for Division Intelligence. "We have actionable intelligence regarding insurgent preparations for attacks against the diplomatic convoy. Request immediate authorization for tactical response based on human intelligence gathering." The response arrived within 20 minutes. Division headquarters authorized immediate tactical operations based on the intelligence Thompson had provided, but they also demanded detailed explanations about how the information had been obtained. Patterson knew that explanation would inevitably lead to investigation of Thompson's unauthorized activities. Meanwhile, Thompson was conducting final reconnaissance to confirm insurgent positions and update intelligence about potential changes in their operational planning. She had spent the night moving between observation positions, using her academic cover to document insurgent activities without arousing suspicion. Her position near the primary staging area allowed her to observe insurgent forces making final preparations for coordinated attacks. The activity confirmed her intelligence about timing and revealed additional details about weapons, placement and coordination protocols that would be valuable for American tactical planning. But Thompson also observed counterintelligence activities that suggested her presence in the area had been detected. Insurgent security elements were conducting systematic searches for potential infiltrators, using methods that indicated professional training and sophisticated understanding of American intelligence capabilities. She realized that her operational window was closing rapidly. Insurgent forces were actively hunting for the teacher who speaks many languages, and her continued presence in the area was becoming increasingly dangerous. But the intelligence she was gathering remained critical for ensuring the diplomatic convoy's safety. Thompson made the decision to transmit real-time updates about insurgent activities, providing American forces with current information about enemy movements and tactical preparations. The communication would definitively expose her operational status, but it would also provide the detailed intelligence needed for immediate tactical response. At Forward Operating Base Blackwater, Thompson's real-time intelligence updates were being used to coordinate helicopter strikes against insurgent staging areas. Special operations teams were positioned to intercept insurgent leadership elements, and electronic warfare units were preparing to disrupt enemy communications during the convoy's passage. The tactical operations based on Thompson's intelligence achieved immediate success. Helicopter strikes eliminated weapons stockpiles and disrupted insurgent coordination. Special operations teams captured key leadership figures, including the man Thompson had identified as the primary coordinator for attacks against the diplomatic convoy. Within 6 hours, insurgent capabilities for conducting coordinated attacks had been systematically dismantled through operations that were possible only because of the intelligence Thompson had gathered through unauthorized reconnaissance. The diplomatic convoy's route had been secured through tactical actions that conventional intelligence methods couldn't have enabled. But Thompson's location had been compromised during the final intelligence transmission. Insurgent counterintelligence operations had identified her position, and hostile forces were moving to intercept her before she could escape the operational area. The rescue operation was launched at 14:30 hours, 8 hours before the diplomatic convoy's scheduled departure. Special operations helicopters approached Thompson's position while she was evading insurgent search teams that had narrowed her location to a small geographic area. Thompson heard the helicopters approaching and activated her emergency beacon, providing precise coordinates for extraction while using her academic cover to remain concealed from insurgent forces. The rescue required careful coordination to avoid compromising her identity during the critical moments before extraction. The helicopter extraction was conducted under fire from insurgent forces who had identified Thompson's position but hadn't yet determined her true identity. She was lifted from the operational area while maintaining her Dr. Halil persona, preserving her cover identity even during the final moments of the operation. Back at Forward Operating Base Blackwater, Thompson was debriefed by intelligence officers who needed to understand the scope of information she had gathered and the methods she had used to obtain it. The debriefing confirmed that her unauthorized operation had provided intelligence that was impossible to acquire through conventional means. Colonel Patterson met with Thompson after the initial debriefing, facing the complex task of addressing her violation of orders while acknowledging that her actions had prevented multiple American casualties. and ensured the success of critical diplomatic negotiations. "Captain Thompson," Patterson began, "your unauthorized operation violated explicit orders and created significant political and operational complications." Thompson maintained military bearing while accepting responsibility for her actions. "Yes, sir. I understood the implications when I made the decision to proceed without authorization. However," Patterson continued, "the intelligence you gathered prevented what would have been a catastrophic attack against the diplomatic convoy. Your operation succeeded where all conventional methods had failed." The conversation continued for 2 hours, addressing the complex intersection of regulatory compliance, operational necessity, and personal accountability. Thompson had saved lives and ensured mission success, but she had done so by violating fundamental principles of military discipline and chain of command. The diplomatic convoy departed on schedule 8 hours later, traveling through routes that had been secured by operations based entirely on Thompson's unauthorized intelligence gathering. The passage was completed without incident, enabling peace negotiations that would eventually end years of regional conflict. But Thompson's military career was effectively over. Her success had been achieved through methods that military leadership couldn't officially acknowledge or endorse. She had proven that unconventional approaches could succeed when conventional doctrine failed, but she had also demonstrated the political impossibility of operating outside established regulatory frameworks. The final irony was complete. Thompson had achieved everything military intelligence was supposed to accomplish. She had gathered actionable intelligence, enabled successful tactical operations, and prevented American casualties. But she had done so through unauthorized methods that ensured her success would also be her ending. In 14 hours, the diplomatic convoy would reach its destination safely, carrying negotiators toward peace talks that could end the conflict. The success would be attributed to superior military planning and effective intelligence operations. Thompson's role would remain classified, her methods would be officially disapproved, and her career would be concluded through administrative action that acknowledged her violation of orders while ignoring her operational achievements. The vindication was complete, but Pyrrhic. Thompson had proven her point about the effectiveness of unconventional intelligence methods, but proving that point had required sacrificing her ability to continue utilizing those methods in military service. 6 months after the diplomatic convoy successfully reached its destination, Captain Sarah Thompson sat in a small cafe in Washington, D.C., watching morning commuters hurry past rain-streaked windows. Her civilian clothes felt strange after 15 years of military uniforms, but the transition had been inevitable from the moment she transmitted that first intelligence report from the abandoned communications tower. The honorable discharge. Papers in her briefcase bore official language about administrative separation due to policy violations, but they didn't mention that her unauthorized operation had prevented what intelligence analysts later confirmed would have been the largest coordinated attack against American diplomatic personnel in the region's history. The classified after-action reports described the insurgent operation as professionally planned and comprehensively prepared, with capabilities that would have overwhelmed any conventional security measures. Thompson's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, her former linguistics professor at Georgetown University. "Coffee meeting still on for 10 a.m.? The International Development Institute is very interested in your application for the regional analysis position." The irony wasn't lost on her. The academic credentials she had developed as cover identities were now becoming her actual career path. Dr. Amira Halil's research background had proven more professionally valuable than Captain Thompson's military service record, at least for organizations that needed cultural expertise without the political complications of military connections. But the transition from military service to civilian analysis work represented more than just a career change. It reflected a fundamental shift in how unconventional problems were being addressed by institutions that couldn't officially acknowledge the limitations of conventional approaches. The regional analysis position would involve exactly the kind of work Thompson had been conducting during her unauthorized operation: cultural assessment, linguistic analysis, and human intelligence gathering in regions where conventional diplomatic and military approaches had proven inadequate. The difference was that civilian organizations could utilize methods that military regulations prohibited. Thompson opened her laptop and reviewed the presentation she would deliver to the Institute's board of directors that afternoon. The proposal outlined approaches for gathering intelligence in politically sensitive environments, using academic cover identities, cultural adaptation techniques, and networks of human sources that operated independently of official government channels. Everything she was proposing represented methods that had been deemed too risky, too uncontrollable, and too politically dangerous for military utilization. But those same methods were increasingly recognized as essential for understanding complex international situations that conventional analysis couldn't adequately address. The breakfast crowd in the cafe included several people Thompson recognized from her morning routine: government workers heading to offices and agencies that officially didn't exist, contractors whose business cards listed consulting firms that specialized in cultural advisory services, and academics whose research somehow always seemed to address regions where American interests were at stake. Washington operated on multiple levels of official and unofficial activity. The people making headlines worked in buildings with public addresses and congressional oversight. The people solving actual problems worked in locations that didn't appear on organizational charts, using methods that weren't acknowledged in policy documents. Thompson had discovered that her experience wasn't unique. Military officers, intelligence analysts, and diplomatic personnel routinely encountered situations where official protocols were inadequate for achieving necessary objectives. Most accepted the limitations and worked within established systems. A few chose to operate outside those systems and faced consequences similar to what Thompson had experienced. Her phone rang with a call from Marcus Chun, a former special operations officer who now worked for a private security firm that provided risk assessment services for international development organizations. Chun's company employed numerous former military personnel whose careers had ended after they achieved objectives through unauthorized methods. "Sarah, I wanted to give you a heads up about the Institute position," Chun said. "They're impressed with your cultural analysis capabilities, but they're concerned about the political sensitivity of hiring someone whose military career ended due to unauthorized operations." Thompson wasn't surprised. Her success in gathering intelligence that prevented attacks against the diplomatic convoy had been classified at levels that made it impossible to discuss during civilian job interviews. Potential employers saw only the administrative separation from military service, not the operational achievements that had led to that separation. "What's their specific concern?" Thompson asked. "They need to maintain plausible deniability about their intelligence gathering methods," Chun replied. "Hiring someone with your background sends signals about the kinds of operations they might be conducting. It's a capability they want, but they can't appear to want it officially." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, addressing the complex dynamics of organizations that needed unconventional capabilities, but couldn't officially acknowledge utilizing methods that exceeded legal or political boundaries. Thompson's experience represented exactly what such organizations required, but her documented history of unauthorized operations made her a liability for institutions that operated through official channels. After ending the call, Thompson reviewed news reports about the peace negotiations that had been enabled by the successful diplomatic convoy mission. The talks had produced agreements that ended active hostilities and established frameworks for regional stability that had prevented thousands of additional casualties. None of the news coverage mentioned the intelligence operation that had made the negotiations possible. Official accounts credited superior military planning and effective coordination between intelligence agencies for ensuring the convoy's safety. Thompson's role remained classified, her methods were officially disapproved, and her contributions were attributed to institutional capabilities rather than individual initiative. Thompson knew that similar situations were developing in regions around the world where conventional approaches were proving inadequate for addressing complex political and security challenges. The same institutional limitations that had nearly led to disaster during the diplomatic convoy mission were creating vulnerabilities in other critical situations. She opened a secure email from Dr. James Harrison, a former State Department official, who now directed a think tank that studied adaptive approaches to international security challenges. Harrison's organization was developing proposals for policy reforms that would enable more flexible responses to situations where conventional diplomatic and military methods were insufficient. Sarah, Harrison's message read, "Your experience demonstrates the gap between what our institutions can officially authorize and what our personnel need to accomplish for national security purposes. We're organizing a conference about operational innovation in complex environments and would like you to present a case study about alternative intelligence gathering methods." The invitation represented an opportunity to influence policy discussions about institutional adaptation, but it also required Thompson to discuss her unauthorized operation in a forum that would inevitably include oversight officials and congressional staff members. Speaking about her experience could contribute to necessary reforms, but it could also create additional political complications. Thompson walked to the window and watched pedestrians navigating puddles left by the morning rain. Each person was following individual routes toward destinations that required adaptation to changing conditions. The successful ones adjusted their paths based on obstacles they encountered, while others remained committed to original plans regardless of changing circumstances. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it was accurate. Institutional success required the same kind of adaptability that individuals demonstrated when navigating unexpected challenges. Organizations that couldn't adapt to changing conditions would encounter the same failures that had nearly destroyed the diplomatic convoy mission. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted message from someone identified only as Prairie Dog, using communication protocols that suggested intelligence community background. The message contained a news article about successful counter-terrorism operations in Southeast Asia, with specific mention of innovative intelligence gathering techniques that enabled precise tactical responses. The article didn't provide details about those techniques, but Thompson recognized the operational patterns. Someone was conducting the same kind of unauthorized intelligence gathering that she had utilized, achieving success through methods that exceeded official authorization, while accepting personal risks that conventional approaches couldn't justify. The message included a brief note: "Others are following the path you marked. The work continues, even when the workers change." Thompson understood the implications. Her unauthorized operation had demonstrated that effective action was possible, even when institutional systems failed completely. That demonstration was influencing other personnel who faced similar impossible choices between regulatory compliance and operational necessity, but the message also suggested a troubling pattern. Individual personnel were being forced to choose between following orders that led to mission failure and taking unauthorized action that ended their careers. The institutional system was consuming its most effective operators by creating situations where success required violating the rules that governed their service. Thompson closed her laptop and prepared for her interview with the International Development Institute. The position would allow her to continue utilizing the skills that had proven so effective during her military service, but through civilian channels that could operate more flexibly than military institutions. The transition represented both personal opportunity and institutional failure. Civilian organizations were increasingly hiring former military personnel specifically because they possessed capabilities that official government agencies couldn't utilize due to regulatory constraints. As Thompson walked through the rain toward her appointment, she reflected on the broader implications of her experience. The diplomatic convoy had reached its destination safely. Peace negotiations had succeeded, and regional stability had been preserved. But those achievements had required abandoning established procedures and accepting methods that couldn't be officially acknowledged or systematically implemented. The success raised fundamental questions about institutional adaptation. If effective action required operating outside established systems, then those systems needed to be reformed to enable rather than prevent necessary operations. If personnel were forced to choose between mission success and regulatory compliance, then regulations needed to be modified to support rather than obstruct critical objectives. But Thompson also understood the political realities that made such reforms difficult to implement. Her unauthorized operation had succeeded because it operated outside systems that could be monitored, controlled, and held accountable through normal oversight mechanisms. Institutionalizing such methods would require accepting risks that democratic societies were reluctant to embrace. The fundamental tension remained unresolved. Complex international challenges required flexible, adaptive responses that exceeded the boundaries of conventional institutional capabilities. But democratic governance required accountability, oversight, and regulatory compliance that inherently limited institutional flexibility. Thompson's experience suggested that resolution might require new frameworks that balanced operational necessity with democratic accountability. Organizations needed the ability to respond effectively to complex challenges, while maintaining transparency and oversight appropriate for democratic societies. The rain intensified as Thompson approached the Institute's building. She paused beneath an awning to check her presentation one final time, reviewing proposals for intelligence, gathering methods that could operate within legal and political boundaries while achieving objectives that conventional approaches couldn't accomplish. Her experience had proven that effective action was possible when institutional systems failed, but it had also demonstrated the personal costs of operating outside established frameworks. The challenge was developing institutional capabilities that could achieve similar effectiveness without requiring individual personnel to sacrifice their careers for mission success. Thompson entered the building knowing that her presentation would contribute to ongoing discussions about institutional reform, but also understanding that meaningful change would require accepting political risks that few organizations were prepared to embrace. Her story would serve as both inspiration and warning about the consequences of choosing effectiveness over compliance in situations where both couldn't be achieved simultaneously. The message was complex but clear. When systems fail, individuals must choose between accepting failure and accepting consequences. Thompson had chosen consequences and achieved success, but the broader challenge remained institutional rather than individual. Real progress would require developing systems that enabled rather than prevented the kind of adaptive action that critical situations demanded. Her experience proved that such action was possible, but it also demonstrated that making it sustainable would require fundamental changes in how democratic institutions balanced effectiveness with accountability in an increasingly complex world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.